Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another of our Environmental Essentials webinars. On behalf of the Bracewell Environment, Lands, and Resources team, this is Tim Wilkins from the Austin office. Happy to be discussing this morning hazardous waste issues for Texas facilities. There have been some very important recent updates in RCRA law in Texas, and it really syncs up interestingly with what's been going on in the enforcement world when it comes to hazardous waste. And I thought it would be a useful opportunity to catch everybody up for those who have facilities in Texas that generate hazardous waste. By way of overview, we're going to provide a little bit of a primer on RCRA generator requirements, folks who generate hazardous waste. I think most folks on this call will be familiar with the basics, but for those who may not be, I want to establish a little bit of a baseline. Then we're going to talk about the phenomenon known as episodic generation of hazardous waste and sort of what that means, how it works, and why it's a problem. We will then discuss EPA Region 6's RCRA enforcement initiative, which has been a really significant thing going on since about 2015. We'll talk about the EPA's Generator Improvements Rule, which is a RCRA rule that's been around for several years, but was only adopted this spring in Texas. We'll talk about some practical tips on RCRA compliance going forward, especially with respect to episodic generation. And then we'll talk about some practical tips for addressing potential past non-compliance that folks may be dealing with. Let's start with the generator requirements primer. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is the cradle-to-grave statutory and regulatory scheme addressing the generation and disposal and handling of hazardous wastes. The basic RCRA scheme goes like this. If you have a solid waste, which is a liquid solid or containerized gas, that is going to be disposed or otherwise abandoned or potentially recycled solid waste that exhibits a hazardous characteristic or that is a specifically listed hazardous waste, those materials are subject to very tight controls from the point of generation through transportation through ultimate disposal, cradle to grave. There are a variety of exemptions and exclusions that are out there. RCRA is a really sort of complicated scheme, but the bottom line is if you are a facility that has industrial operations, you likely generate solid wastes, some of which will be hazardous and some of which will not be exempt or excluded. Folks in that position are required to manage and dispose of their hazardous wastes in very particular ways. The people who create that hazardous waste, whose processes produce that kind of waste, are known as generators under the RCRA scheme. For generators, there are three big picture classifications. You are either a large quantity, small quantity, or what they call conditionally exempt or very small quantity generator of hazardous waste. These are three very bright line cutoffs based on kilograms generated in a given calendar month. If you generate more than 1,000 kilograms of hazardous waste in a calendar month, you are a large quantity generator. If you generate more than 100 but less than 1,000, you're a small quantity generator for that calendar month. If you generate less than 100 kilograms of hazardous waste, you are a conditionally exempt or very small quantity generator. I say conditionally exempt or very small quantity generator until the most recent adoption in Texas of EPA's rules. Conditionally exempt was the old language that we used around this for the less than 100 kilo a month generators. They are now called very small quantity generators. They are not conditionally exempt, they're just very small. This is really importantly, again, a monthly calculation. So you could be, by generating 1,000 kilograms of hazardous waste in January and 500 kilograms in February, you could be a large quantity generator in 1 month and a small quantity generator in the next month. It varies. And this is important because what you have to do from a regulatory perspective is based on your generator classification. It's based on how much waste you generate in a given month. The RCRA requirements are based on your classification. For large quantity generators, understandably, people who have more hazardous waste should probably be subject to more stringent controls, both because it's more dangerous, but they're also more frequently dealing with it. Smaller quantity generators maybe don't need to be controlled quite as stringently as that. The requirements for generators include things like training of personnel who are going to interact with the waste, contingency plans and emergency response plans. For certain categories of wastes, emission controls on the storage of that kind of hazardous waste, waste minimization programs, annual and biennial reporting, closure requirements. There are a variety of things, in addition to requirements that are applicable further down the chain to small quantity and even in many instances, very small quantity generators. Things like labeling your drums, keeping drums closed, starting accumulation dates, getting stuff disposed of in a timely fashion within 90 days as a large quantity generator or 180 days as a small quantity generator. These are the sorts of requirements that are applicable to RCRA hazardous waste generators. If your generation rate varies, you need to make sure that you're meeting whatever the minimum requirements are for your status in a given calendar month. Again, this is month to month. These are based on actual generation rates, not average generation rates. So if you generate hazardous waste as a large quantity generator 1 month out of the year, but you're a small quantity generator the rest of the year, you are out of compliance with RCRA if you are not meeting the more stringent large quantity generator regs for the month in which you're a large quantity generator. And this is really complicated, right? Because the requirement is effectively a one-way ratchet. If you are normally someone who generates 150 kilos a month, and then just one time for whatever reason you generate over 1,000, you are subject to the requirement to train the employees, to develop the contingency plans, to make those reports. And this is really effectively a one-way ratchet. Even though you're 90% of the time a small quantity generator, you can't be in compliance unless you've done the training, done the plan, done the reporting, and it's a one-way ratchet. You can't untrain or unplan or unreport. So effectively, if you're even only occasionally a large quantity generator, you need to comply with large quantity generator standards. And this is really complicated. And it's sometimes really difficult because a lot of times people don't know that they've accidentally tripped over that limit, that they've accidentally gone over the 1,000 kilo threshold in a given month until later. So let's keep going with this. That's the background on what RCRA is and how generators are regulated under the RCRA program. So episodic generation is a really important concept here. Episodic generation is the idea that there will be episodes of higher generation than normal. Steady state generation of waste is normal in a lot of industries. A lot of hazardous waste is a process byproduct, and you're making 1 million pounds of a chemical in a given month, and there's 1% that comes off of that that's a byproduct that has to be disposed of. That's a sort of steady state generation rate, X amount of catalyst or Y amount of a byproduct stream, something that you're generating regularly because you're producing regularly. There are also facilities that are just always going to be large quantity generators, not because it's steady state, but because they've got a lot of streams, a lot of hazardous waste being generated in a lot of areas, and they're just going to have large volumes generated, so they'll always be over 1,000 kilos a month. For those facilities, you just comply with the large quantity standards, and episodic generation doesn't really matter that much. But for facilities with variable generation, that's also a norm in a lot of industries. There are a lot of facilities that really generate very little hazardous waste as a routine matter, and they only become large generators when they do special projects, when there's a facility turnaround, when there's a clean out of tanks or boilers, when there's a big housekeeping project, like let's get rid of all those old off-spec whatevers. Those are scenarios where you can generate a lot of hazardous waste, even though your steady state generation is very low. There are also unanticipated events. You could create off-specification batch of some product that just can't be reused for whatever reason and needs to be disposed. Even though I'm normally creating about 200 kilos a month, man, I just made 20,000 kilos of a bad batch that needs to be disposed of. Or you could have spills, cleanups, scenarios like that, where the material that spilled was listed when disposed or is characteristic as disposed, and you need to dispose of that as hazardous waste. It's not a planned event. It's something that has happened in an unplanned way, but you generate, a large quantity of material. So there are planned events like maintenance, turnarounds, housekeeping. There are unplanned events like errors in manufacturing or spills or cleanups, but these are non-steady state generation situations. These are what we call episodic generation events. It is generation of hazardous waste streams that result from particular events rather than some continuous or ongoing or steady state activity. It is important here that the left hand and right hand know what each other are doing. And when I say left hand, right hand, I mean operations or maintenance or whoever is doing the project or handling this off-spec batch or responding to a spill. Those may not be the same people who know the RCRA regulations as a day-to-day matter. And so you've got situations where, wow, we just generated a lot of hazardous waste. We call a vendor, they come in, they profile it, they dispose of it. But if you're not talking to the people that are managing your RCRA program, you may not put together two and two that, oh my gosh, I've just become a large quantity generator, and now I'm subject to all of these additional requirements. And that can be really, really significant. It is hard to turn on the dime in a space of a month and go from being a small quantity or even very small quantity generator to becoming a large quantity generator and complying with all of those requirements. If you don't have a formal LQG contingency plan or haven't performed LQG level training, it's really hard to do that during the same calendar month that, I became a large quantity generator. And if that generation, if that episode occurs on the 25th of the month, well, man, it's even especially hard to come into compliance. You're a large quantity generator for April, but it's April 25th and you just found out. How do you get into compliance with that? Even if you find out when it's happening and not months later, it is really difficult to comply. What if you don't realize that the waste that's being generated from the process is hazardous until the event is over? It's going to be really difficult to make sure that you're complying with the LQG requirements. So a lot of companies who have dealt with this episodic issue have just said, well, I don't know what to do other than just to pretend I'm in LQG all the time because I'm going to be in LQG some of the time because I have episodes. And so that creates a big, significant additional regulatory burden. Let's pause there on what the RCRA program looks like and what episodic generation is. And I'm going to talk about a really sort of significant negative consequence of episodic generation and how it's been dealt with by our regulators. There has been, since at least 2015, a major enforcement initiative going on at EPA Region 6. There is more hazardous waste generated in EPA Region 6, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, than in all of the other regions. This is the highest hazardous waste generating region in the country, and it's viewed as a very significant issue. But EPA realized several years ago that there were a lot of facilities out there that were generating large quantities of hazardous waste, but not complying with the large quantity requirements. So what EPA has been doing since about 2015 is gathering disposal records from the commercial hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. They have been asking them to report on which companies, which facilities are disposing how much hazardous waste and when. They can determine from this that facility X sent 5,000 kilograms of hazardous waste to this disposal facility. They are then using an algorithm, a desktop, computer-based effort to identify people who have disposed of large quantities of hazardous waste in particular months, but who are claiming or are registered as generators of less than 1,000, even sometimes as less than 100 kilogram generators in calendar months. They are looking for episodic generation for facilities that are classed as SQGs or VSQGs. And when they find those, they have been sending show cause letters. They have been commencing enforcement actions with follow-up information requests and pursuing these to final order, alleging failure to notify of a generator classification change. In other words, you're listed as an SQG. For these months, you were an LQG because I see it in the disposal records, and you did not update EPA. That's a violation. Additionally, they've been citing people for failing to comply with the LQG regulations during those months that they were LQGs, even though they're normally SQGs or VSQGs. There are also other potential violations that come up through that information gathering process, but really items 1 and 2 there are the big citations. These have led to dozens of enforcement cases each year since 2015, and the penalties these days are often in the 6 figures for companies that have been in that situation. Again, here's what's happening. You've got facilities that are day-to-day VSQGs or SQGs who have an episodic generation event north of 1,000 kilograms. They send it to the disposal facility. EPA sees that disposal, follows up with the company that is registered as an SQG or VSQG, and commences an enforcement action against them. That has been happening every day since 2015, and it's really a significant deal. These cases, make no mistake, are cases built on errors by episodic generators. They are commonly finding 1, 2, 3, 4 months of outlier events over periods of years. This is something that EPA is doing, even though TCEQ has delegation in Texas for the RCRA issues. TCEQ knows about this event. It's something that they're all sort of cooperating on. But this is really a problem because I'm in SQG every day. We had a spill at the plant. Nobody told me over here in the environmental management world. And now I'm an LQG, even though I'm a very small quantity generator 11 months out of the year. That's right. You violated RCRA by not cluing to that and getting all of those requirements in place. That's the enforcement action EPA has been pursuing, and it's a very significant issue. So what happens in February of 2022? EPA's 2016 Generator Improvements Rule, this is not a misnomer, it is actually an improvement for generators. The Generator Improvements Rule is adopted effective in February 22 by TCEQ. Here's what the Generator Improvements Rule does. It allows generators to have one episodic event each calendar year without changing generator classification or complying with the more stringent regulations. If you're an everyday small quantity generator and you have a turnaround that makes you a large quantity generator for 1 month, that's fine. Here's what you've got to do. For a planned event like a turnaround or a maintenance event, you have to let the agency know 30 days in advance that that's coming. If it's an unplanned event like a spill or one of those off-spec batch generation things, you have to let them know within 72 hours after it happens. You get one of those a year, and if you have a planned event and then an unplanned event, they'll give you the opportunity to petition for a second event. You need to provide some justification for that. But this is a fantastic piece of news for those people who have been stuck as a result of, hey, I'm a small quantity generator and I had that one episode. This is a great opportunity for you. But you've got to make those notices and you've got to comply with these very specific requirements as well. There are specific regulatory requirements for these episodes. It only works if you have an EPA ID number. Small quantity generators should already have those. Very small quantity generators may not have those, so they may want to apply for one. But there are specific labeling and dating requirements that are different than standard hazardous wastes. You've got to have an emergency coordinator designated. You've got to use manifests. That's pretty standard. You've got 60 days to dispose of the episodic waste. This is different. If you're a small quantity generator, you normally have 180. And there's additional record keeping. But these are all things that are very manageable so long as the people who are going to know about and experience this planned or unplanned episode, so long as that's all coordinated up with the people who understand what the generator improvement rule requirements are. If you coordinate this can totally be done. This can totally work. Practical tips going forward. This rule is great. It does not solve the left-hand, right-hand problem. The person doing the episodic project still needs to know that it's going to generate hazardous waste. They need to be aware of that. And they still need to tell somebody 30 days ahead who can help them fill out the right paperwork and apply the right procedures here. But if you comply with the episodic generation rule, this generator improvements rule, if you follow the procedures and do some training, this will really work. Practical tips you should be thinking about. Who at the facilities I'm involved with will know about the planned events that are going to generate episodic hazardous waste? Who manages and announces turnarounds or tank cleanouts or boiler cleanouts, major facility housekeeping events? Who does that? You need to know who those people are so they know to tell EHS staff well in advance of a 30-day mark so that 30-day advance notice can be provided to the agency. What about when unplanned events happen that would generate hazardous waste? Who's going to know about that off-spec batch? Who's going to know about a spill? Those folks are going to need to know, again, to tell the folks in EHS within 72 hours, in fact, immediately, what's happened so that those people can do the 72-hour episodic reporting. And your EHS staff obviously needs to be deep into these episodic generator regs so they know exactly what procedures need to be followed, exactly what reports need to be made, exactly what information needs to be gathered so that those can be filed timely. What's the procedure look like when those folks say, wow, okay, we've got a maintenance coming up, or wow, we've just had a spill? When they become aware of that event, what information do they need to be collecting, recording, sharing, and who do they need to call when that happens? You need to set up the training, you need to set up the procedures, the communication pathways to ensure that all happens, again, so that the left hand and the right hand are working together. Who's going to know and understand the triggers so we ensure that they are timely connected with the folks who know what to do? It really merits a careful walkthrough, maybe even a tabletop type exercise to make sure that the right people know the right things so that we can take advantage of these rules. And this is important. EPA is continuing with this initiative in the background. EPA is continuing with this enforcement effort in the background. They have had some sympathy for people who generate small quantities 11 months out of the year and then have one episode that takes them out of that. They're going to continue to enforce, but there's at least an argument they hear that, man, we're always a small quantity generator. This was a surprise, and there's no pressure relief valve in the Texas rules that allows us to do anything about that. That defense is now gone, and there's going to be less sympathy from EPA because we've got that pressure relief valve now. There is that escape hatch. We've got an episodic generator rule that allows us to make that notice and avoid those difficult regulatory complications. And if we fail to meet that, EPA will have even less sympathy than they already do. This is also important. Practical tips looking backward. If you're properly prepared, your facilities can have these episodic events and stay in compliance while keeping your lower generator status. But that's only useful starting in February of 2022. EPA's enforcement initiative is backward looking. The statute of limitations is 5 years. That means you've got 4 years and 10 months of exposure still out there for when you didn't have that escape hatch. What do I do if I think I may have had past episodic issues that EPA has not enforced on yet, but they still could? So my suggestion here is that you take the opportunity provided by the Texas Audit Privilege Act or the EPA audit policy, or both. These provisions provide an opportunity for you to do an environmental compliance assessment. You can focus it to RCRA issues, to generation issues. If you find you have had episodic large quantity generation and have not complied with all the LQG requirements, including notice, including the generator requirements, you can disclose those past gaps to EPA and or to TCEQ. You can install corrective and preventive actions. And if you do this properly, you can get penalty relief, right? You can get actual leniency against any penalties that EPA or TCEQ might propose here or might pursue here. It is important to know that these are procedure-heavy tools with different deadlines, different very specific methods of how you make disclosures. EPA has an e-disclosure portal that is highly counterintuitive. Texas requires you to first notice that you're doing the audit and then to disclose via certified mail on a particular format. These are things that you want to proceed with caution on. But if you have made this mistake in the past and EPA has not caught you yet, these tools offer you the opportunity to go find those problems, fix those problems, disclose those problems, and kill off your enforcement exposure. So really important stuff there. I would encourage everybody who has got a concern about past episodic generation that doesn't have the benefit of the generator improvements rule to consider that look back. So in terms of questions, if you have any questions, feel free to post those in the Q&A box or just send me an email, tim.wilkins@bracewell.com, and I'd be happy to engage with you on that. The new TCEQ episodic generator rules for hazardous waste are a huge benefit for VSQG and SQG facilities in Texas that have the potential to periodically trigger larger quantity requirements in any given month. If the left hand and right hand within your company aren't talking, though, it's really easy to miss making the right notices or complying with all of the episodic generator requirements that allow you to stay in your category. And that is a really important exposure issue because of the ongoing EPA enforcement initiative. I encourage everybody to put careful training and procedures in place so that you don't miss the opportunities that this episodic generator rule will provide you for those episodic events. And then looking back, before this rule went into effect, you have the ability to kill off your penalty exposure by using these audit and disclosure tools to figure out when you may have made that mistake in the past, to box out those risks, and to proceed to eliminate penalties using those tools. It's something you've got to be careful about. There's a lot of procedure around that. Holler if you have any questions about that. But it's really, I think, a great time to put yourself on a path toward success for both doing it right going forward and cleaning up what may have gone wrong in the past. Look forward to hearing from folks in the email and in the Q&A. And thank you again for your time today. Really appreciate it. Good luck with the generator improvements rule. Thanks, everyone.